Hello, my name is Peaslee, and I'd like to thank the organizers first for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to tell a quick story on PFAS and what they are, and how to measure them in the environment. I apologize for not being there in person. I'm abroad at the moment, but I'd like to be able to include pesticides in the environment and say why and how the PFAS are there, and then give some suggestions as to how to measure them. PFAS is a large class of organic chemicals called per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances. A picture of one is shown here. They're developed in around World War II. They're all man-made, and they have a confusing array of names over the years. But since about 2012 or so, we've settled on this PFAS nomenclature. There's over 12,000 of them that are currently listed on the EPA website. They have amazing properties. They are a surfactant. You can see the fellow on the right here treated with a PFAS outfit, and the guy on the left is not. They're used on carpets, textiles, paints, cosmetics, coatings, you name it. They're a type of lubricant or surfactant that's used everywhere. There's over 200 known industrial uses already, of over 1,300 PFAS, specific PFAS, out of the 12,000 that we know exist. Some of those are not commercially made. They're degradation products of the original ones, but they're all different types of PFAS. Some background chemistry, just to get us all on the same page, is that they have this long chain of carbon in gray, with green is the fluorine in this particular style of looking at them. They have these long chains that are very water repellent, and then a head group, which is either a carbonate on top or a carboxylic acid on top, or a sulfonate on the bottom, or a sulforamine on the bottom. And these are different. It gives them different properties, but all of them have a wonderful surfactant property where this one end loves water and the other end likes air, or something that oil, something that isn't water. And so they work well as a soap, but they also work extremely well as a surfactant layer to prevent water resistance or stain resistance. The reason they work so well is that there's a bond energy between that carbon and fluorine bond, which is the strongest bond in the chemistry periodic table. I mean, carbon and fluorine is the strongest single bond of all the atoms, and so it's the hardest to break. We have used them everywhere, from our non-stick cookware to carpets to microwave popcorn. You can ask me about that later. While it prevents the water from inside the kernel getting the bag wet, the paper bag wet, it has some other consequences. What's the problem? Well, since the carbon-fluorine bond is so strong, they have environmental lifetimes in the hundreds or thousands of years. There's no known organism that will eat on these things because they don't get any energy out of eating them. There's one weird microbe that's been discovered that sort of chews on some of them, but it's only the large ones that break down to small ones. These small ones persist forever, and these are why they're given the moniker forever chemicals. One of the consequences of it is that these chemicals, once they're made, they don't degrade. They can pass right through the wastewater treatment plant and get into our drinking water. And the drinking water gets into us, or gets into our food, which then gets into us. And it can come from any number of sources. From firefighting foam is the largest one we think that's gotten out there, but it also comes from our landfills. Of all the materials that we've treated in the last 70 years that have come out of the landfill are starting to come out and will haunt us for the next hundreds of decades or centuries, till this stuff gets all the way through the water and through our bodies. In drinking water, we've got a map currently on the EWG working website, the Environmental Working Group website, that shows how many states are actively looking for PFAS, and you can count on one hand the ones that have done a good job so far, and then the rest of us that are slowly beginning to get there. It's not that there aren't any PFAS in Indiana, just nobody's looked for them yet. We're starting to. And the EPA has made a health advisory limit that we're at 70 parts per trillion, but startled everybody by going down 1,700-fold to 0.004 parts per trillion for PFOA and 0.02 parts per trillion for PFAS, and including a couple others that are a little higher levels. This is concerning because these are the concentrations at which you begin to see adverse health effects. And of course, those health effects don't just have to be humans, they could be in the environment. There's both bioaccumulation and biomagnification of these chemicals. Since they're so long, they live in the decades to centuries in the environment. That means that when we eat fish that have eaten items that have been exposed to this, we'll pick up what's in the fish. The polar bear don't really eat a lot of popcorn, but they do eat seals, that eat the fish, that eat the krill, that have been swimming through this waste AFFF for years, and therefore the polar bear blood has a fair amount. Human blood in North America consists of about 5 parts per billion of these man-made chemicals, and we see it in every person in North America at this point. And of course, there are the unfortunate adverse health effects that come with them. And everybody knows the C8 study because it was so famous. There's a movie about it. But it's this cancer cluster, and there are 6 diseases that are known to be correlated with this exposure to C8, which is a one particular type of PFAS. And it led to the voluntary removal of this PFOA and PFAS from use for manufacture in the United States. They're still used, but not manufactured in the United States any longer. And the diseases, there are 2 types of cancer. There are kidney and testicular hypertension and pregnancy-induced hypertension, preeclampsia, ulcerative colitis. And now, if we look in the literature, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of other diseases that are being discovered from the year 2000 to 2000 instead of a few studies a year. Last year we topped over 1,400 studies that, if you look up PFAS or PFC and health, you'll see over 1,400 papers published on this. So there's a scary amount being discovered. Probably the most insidious one is the immune system reduction. This is the reduction of the immune system of vaccines, for example, vaccine titer, if you've been exposed to these, observed in both Europe and in America. These and now elsewhere. This is the reason that the European Food Safety Commission reset the limits lower on the amount allowable in food. It was because that was the most sensitive effect that they found. The American standards were set on, I believe, a thyroid cancer or pancreatic cell cancer cell line that was so sensitive that they could lower the limits that much. So how are they measured? In general, they're measured by this wonderful instrument on the right called a liquid chromatography tandem mass spec. This is a sophisticated instrument, costs $250,000. They have run for 15 to 20 years now a standard method for drinking water the EPA's had out called 537.1, or a 533 method, which is slightly different number of analytes in that, but about between 20 to 32 analytes of these 12,000 compounds. And there's a new method out that's still draft stage, but is being used by commercial labs called EPA method 1633, designed specifically for sediment, sludge, and fish and biota, sort of nastier matrices than drinking water. This instrument has exquisite sensitivity. It'll identify PFOA and tell it apart from PFAS, which the rest of us can barely do, looking at the pictures on the left. It needs lots of time and it's lengthy analysis, and it needs many standards. You need to have a standard of everything that you measure. And it misses all the volatiles that don't transport through the liquid, and it also misses all the precursor mass. And often the volatiles could be short chains, C2s and C3s, but there'll also be fluorotomer alcohols and things like that that evaporate before you get it into the system. So you don't get everything with this method, but what you do get, you get exquisite sensitivity down to part per trillion or less of some of these elements. And it identifies specifically which ones are there, which helps you identify perhaps the source. The caveat is that it only identifies what it's looking for, what's in the library. So let's look at pesticides for a second. If you were trying to measure these with an LC mass spec, yes, there are some pesticides made with PFAS, the most famous of which is sulfuramide, which is a mainstay in Brazil for the leafcutter ant. And it was an insecticide made out of PFAS. There is a picture of it. You see the long chain of fluorine and carbon in the left, and then a sulfonate group with an amide on it, which makes it a sulfuramide. That's the compound that is very effective at getting leafcutter ants out, but of course led to a tremendous toxicity problem in Brazil's Amazon basin. It's got a massive PFAS contamination. And of course, I looked online, and I can buy 50-gallon drums of this stuff still from Wuhan Bright Chemical, another wonderful product out of Wuhan that we can buy. So these are still around, and they exist. They may enter this country illegally. They're not supposed to be manufactured here, but it's not quite clear what the import-export regulations are. More likely is that some of these pesticides have additives that contain PFAS. And this would be if you're going to take an aerosolized PFAS, you might add a dispersant to it or a solubilizer. And those, the best ones available, are the fluorinated ones. So somebody may have manufactured them with an extra agent. It wouldn't be the active ingredient, but there might be a few percent of these PFAS in as a dispersant or a solubilizer. That could be why a pesticide has PFAS in it. Then there are some pesticides that contain fluorine but are not PFAS. And this gets into a technical definition. If you take a look at, for example, this one at the bottom, India just launched this last year, fluopyrimine, I think I pronounced that right, is a new compound. And you'll see that there's a CF3 group attached to it. So if you measured fluorine, you would see this. But it's only one, and it would break off as a C1, and it wouldn't count as a PFAS by definition. Not that I'd want to drink this, but if it got into the drinking water, it probably wouldn't have the same effect as PFAS, just what the insecticide said, whatever the toxicity of the insecticide would be. The unfortunate part is that more and more pesticides are putting more fluorine in them. So almost 70% of the new agrochemicals approved in the second half of the last decade, this is published in 2020, included a fluorinated grouping in it. That doesn't mean they're PFAS, just that there's a little fluorine in them. So leaving these categories aside, we go back to what there are. There's another source of PFAS in these pesticides, which is a dazzling array of these things. There is a suspicion that a pesticide in Massachusetts recently was tested to found part per billion levels of 1,000 times more than a part per trillion. And those levels are very high if you were to release it into the environment. And they were found at that level because of the argument that the container leached these out into the pesticide. And from all we can tell, that might be one explanation. It may be that another explanation leads to PFAS being in there. But we've managed to reproduce the study that there are some chemically resistant containers that are fluorinated, and they create PFAS, and when you put certain things in them, you'll get PFAS out. And that would be one where the insecticide did not have PFAS originally, but after it got stored in this container for a month or two, it's loaded with PFAS, and therefore would not be good to get out in the environment. And then, of course, there's the last category, which we're all very interested in, which are the pesticides that don't contain PFAS and won't have any other additional sources added to them. This leaching result came out recently in September of 2022. They studied that there are surrogates you could put into these containers and leach out. When it comes to measuring fluorine overall, what should we do? So there's our LC mass spec. That's the red thing in the middle, and this is sort of a Venn diagram approach to it. That you can target certain PFAS, look for P4, look for PFOS, look for PFHXS or PFBA, and all these various chemicals that are of concern to the EPA, you can look for them, and you'll find them down to part per trillion levels. If they're in your insecticide, you probably wouldn't want to be dispersing that, not only for the insecticide to reach in the environment, but for, even if the insecticide broke down in the environment, biocompatible insecticide, these PFAS would pass right through and get into biota and the environment. There are several other types of methods by which you can measure more fluorine, and so what we're going to describe now is a couple of total organofluorine measurements, and I'm going to specifically talk about ours that we developed at Notre Dame, Piggy, to get the total fluorine measurement and why you want to do that. So this is a spectroscopic tool to look for just the fluorine part of the molecule. And if it's a PFAS, it's got lots of fluorine. And so therefore, wouldn't it be interesting if instead of doing the long study, we could just take a light source, shine it on a sample, and measure with a detector, sort of like they do with X-ray fluorescence to measure lead in toys coming from China. We would take an available light source, put it on a sample, and tell you instantly whether there's any fluorine in there. And that fluorine we'd use as a surrogate for PFAS. And unfortunately, there's no light sources of the regular type UV-Vis or for FTIR, infrared spectroscopy, or NMR, or even XRF that will give you a fluorine signature that you can use. It's not sensitive enough in a couple of these cases. There are no transitions in others. And the FTIR, there's some sensitivity, but there's lots of different things that give the same signature. So what we've used is a gamma ray signal. And using that, we move into this type of instrument. It's a large particle accelerator at the moment. We're making a smaller one for a field application. And we bombard a surface and look for the gamma rays that come off. And we can use this to make a spectrum that looks like that. it shows clearly a popcorn bag versus a regular paper, and you could see right away which one had been treated by PFAS. We've also used it for, and we published a paper in 2017 on fast food packaging, which has encouraged the industry since that time to remove PFAS from all their packaging. In 2020, we followed it up with a study on firefighter textiles. Not only were they being exposed to AFFF, the firefighting foam that has PFAS, but their turnout gear turned out to be made with PFAS, and that was alarming. In recent years, the last year, we published an article on cosmetics and our personal care products that seem to have a lot of PFAS in them as well. And we point out that you could get direct exposure through the skin or through the accidental ingestion, as well as going through the drinking water that everybody will be exposed to. And that one was also widely read. So what I would like to leave the audience with is this idea that we have a complex chemical mix in insecticides. There's always a lot of ingredients in there. My proposal would be that you should screen pesticides for the presence of total organofluorine. There are several commercial methods to do this. We've just got one, but there are other ways that can also measure total organofluorine. And if there's no fluorine, then you have a pesticide that has no PFAS in it because there's no fluorine. And that's the trick. Then these tests are typically a lot cheaper and quicker than the tests where you send it off to a lab, wait 6 weeks, and find out, yep, there's this many parts per trillion of this, that, the other. If you get a measure of fluorine that's 0 or below detection limit, you'll say, okay, then there will be no organofluorine at that level. There can't be any PFAS at that level. And bear in mind, there are several ways that manufacturers will not know whether they have unintended PFAS present or not. They probably know if they're intentionally putting it in there. But if they're unintentionally getting in there from some chemical that they added as a dispersant, but they didn't read the label or it wasn't told to them that it's PFAS, or if it is a contamination from a container, which was being shown, it could happen, though it's not the most likely source, I would say. Or there may be somebody developing a new insecticide that has got PFAS in it that nobody knows about. So these are areas where you'd like to stay alert as a regulatory agency or as a monitoring agency and measure that. And if there is no PFAS, if there's no fluorine, then there'll be no PFAS in that mixture. If you go ahead and do get a fluorine signature, then a small subset of those that do have some fluorine in them, you want to see whether it is a fluorinated pesticide that shows up or whether that is something that is a well-known PFAS. And for that, EPA draft method 1633 will work. It's a very complete and rather time-consuming and expensive test, but it will give you a measure of how much PFOS, PFOA, and all the other ones that we can, that works on, I think there are 40 compounds that it measures simultaneously, and that will cover most of the known PFAS that we know health effects from. And there are several commercial laboratories that offer this method now. So at that point, that's my quick summary on what PFAS are and how to measure them, and I will leave lots of time for questions if people have them. My email address is included here in case there's any questions that don't get answered in the next 10-12 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Peaslee. Amazing work that you're doing. So we do have some questions that have come in, and I'll read them out for us. This first one, there was a recent study by Lassie. It was targeted analysis and total oxidizable precursor assay of several insecticides for PFAS. And the paper's gotten a lot of attention. It tested 10 pesticides that are used on USDA fields and found 6 of them with substantial PFAS, ranging from 4 million PPT to 19 million PPT. And some of these, like imidacloprid and malathion, are widely used. What are you taking away from that study?
No, thank you, Greg, and I thank everybody for listening to my pre-recorded pitch, but being that I'm abroad, they were afraid I wouldn't be able to communicate for so long, so I'm glad to be here to answer questions. And this one I knew about, so I prepared a slide for this one. The others I'll wing it. This is a study that just came out after I wrote the talk, as it turns out. It's a recent study from Jen Guelfo's group in Texas Tech. It's a great group. They know what they're doing. And they have access to a bunch of pesticides. They put them on fields and they measured several things. They measured using an LC mass spec that we talked about, they measured the standard number of 20 to 30 PFAS that they could measure readily with a known method. It isn't an EPA approved method, it's a modified method, but it is a good method. They have proof that they measured them and that they have internal standards that they measure. And they found ppm levels, very high levels in this insecticide concentrate. It was a concentrate they were measuring it in, but they're getting 1,000,000 times higher than drinking water limits or the observations in the environment. So even if you dilute it 1,000-fold, you'd still be 1,000 times more concentrated than what's present or likely to be in the environment. So these are significant amounts of PFAS, and the predominant one was PFOS. It's a C8 sulfonate, and that gives us a signature as to where it might be coming from that we can tell apart from other signatures. The total fluorine was also measured on a couple of these things. They found one that had suspicion of fluorine, but they didn't see any of the ones in the library. And being a good scientist, Jen knew to go and try this total fluorine method. She did it a different way. She used a total oxidizable precursor assay. And sure enough, that one that was empty showed up with a lot of PFOS. This is a test that looked for the total fluorine, and those are PFOS that are being discovered there. It's about 3 times higher than the one that before you do the total fluorine. So that means that there's probably 2/3 we're missing out of the fluorinated studies when you do the level. But when you're in part per million, it doesn't really matter whether you miss a factor of 2 or 3. It's still a lot. The most important thing I found from this article is that they actually tested the fields where this was all 10 pesticides were used on cotton crops, which is not a foodstuff, but they grew on these fields plants afterwards. It's an agricultural school. Texas Tech is ag. So they had these fields where they were rotating crops, and they did cotton one season and food another. And they measured in the soil and the crop uptake PFAS, and they report that in the paper as well. And so that's pretty startling that if we use the insecticide, these forever chemicals last for a season and show up next season's crops, even if they are foodstuffs or not in cotton's case. And so I think this is a good warning shot. It shows a couple of very interesting things. These are available in the US and being used in the US field. And this is a USDA facility that they tested these things on. I think one of the takeaways for this talk will be that how do I know whether it's intentional or not intentional? That's one of the later questions I saw, Greg. So I'll start with that one. The amount. If there are part per trillion in your product, it's not doing anything for your product. You need to have part per millions or hundreds of parts per million to really make a difference. So if you want to see surfactancy, if you want to see some sort of solubility, it's got to be there in a pretty appreciable amount, often at percent level, but often at hundreds of parts per million. And once you get below 100 parts per million, it's probably not doing a lot for your product. So if you intentionally want to use it as that, and there's a wide range of uses, but generally you need it to be enough to be worth it. They're expensive chemicals, so you don't add them in for free just because you've got them. But they could be unintentionally added, which means you added another product for a dispersant or something, a solubilizer or a stabilizer, and these things crept in because you add a few percent of this compound, but that compound is rich in PFAS. Then you'll end up with several hundred part per million, which is what they seem to be getting in these things. The other question that also popped up, I see in the question and answer, I'm skipping ahead, Greg, but it's in the same article, which will prove it, is the type of PFAS that comes out can identify somewhat where it comes from. PFOS is widely used, but primarily in the flame retardant, the firefighting foams. It is not used in the fluorination of containers. So the fact that this is 1,000 times higher than what we saw in a fluorinated container, and that it was PFOS, which we don't see in fluorinated containers, then it's not coming from the container, at least in this study done in Texas Tech. The study done in Massachusetts, there were not PFOS discovered, but PFOA and all the other short chain, what's called carboxylic acids. And that is a signature of what comes out of packaging. And so it could be they were part per billion levels, not part per million, which is still high, but the company claimed they didn't use it. It was coming from the walls. And that's one possibility. It was. It could be that in their manufacturing process, they also use these things from other reasons. But we have to be aware of that. And the EPA has done a nice study to prove this. And we have just submitted a paper for publication on that too, showing that, yeah, it leaches out. So I think those are, it's a long answer, but this was an important paper that came out just after I wrote the paper, after the talk. So I think we wanted to talk about it and say this is a great example of why a state such as Maryland would be interested in testing insecticides for PFAS. And because, yeah, they're there, and 6 out of 10 is a pretty high percentage that had a lot of intentional PFAS in that study. Now, we are not Texas, we are not doing cotton, Maryland, as far as I know. But I think that there are commonly used in pesticides that seem to have some of these things in it. And the question would be how to find out.
Okay, thank you. And I hope we can share a link to that paper. I don't know if it's behind a paywall, but if we can share some more information on how to get to that paper, that would be good for the group. So we'll see if we can.
They published it open access, so everybody can get to it, at least this year. Mm-hmm.
Fabulous. Okay, we'd love to share a link to that paper. So we've got some other questions in here. This one with this high incidence of fluorinated pesticides. Any impacts from these and how they break down that we should be aware of. And I just want to help here a little bit in saying that when you've pointed out just a few minutes ago that PFAS is uptaken into plants, that's a very unique property here. It's different than some of our traditional organochlorine pollutants, for example. I think that's really highly relevant to the risk calculus here for these compounds. Do you agree with that? And any other thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I wasn't even focusing on insecticides a year ago, or I hadn't even thought of it. But this paper that came out saying they're so widely used, and the specific one Leslie just came out is a great fodder for saying that not only is it used, but because of its persistent nature, it's being used on food fields. Even if the crops are rotated through a non-food crop, or you have a cover crop for a year, that pesticide and its residues, the PFAS residues, will often remain. Some of the soluble ones will get in the water stream and disappear. They're all water soluble at some level, but many of them bind to organic compounds. And Chris Higgins at Colorado School of Mine has done a series of studies, 10, 15 years ago now, that showed that various types of leafy vegetables suck these things in preferentially. So there's a definite bioaccumulation. It's much different than many of the organic chemicals we have. It's akin to some of the metals that go up to leafy vegetables very well, but it's a different property that makes them transport. And Higgins is the real expert on that. But it's shocking that if that's where we're spraying them, that we might be exposing our population to another source of these things. Your accidental drinking water is the widest source. And I noticed a comment in there that's saying that, it's the firefighting foam that's getting everywhere. That's true. Most of our drinking water supplies seem to be coming from these Class B foams that were sprayed everywhere. And that's because they're so soluble, they get in the drinking water and they don't get filtered out by any process that's normally done. So that means they are in our drinking water, and most of our exposure is probably drinking water. But food is a close second in the sense that, if they're in fish and we're eating a lot of fish, we see that. If we have added it as an insecticide, and this was, a year ago, an unknown path, the insecticides were well known, but we didn't know that PFAS might be coming along with them, then I think there is an exposure risk that some of the foodstuffs might be high. And there's an example of a firefighter in Australia who was, they did a survey of 700 firefighters, and they looked at their blood levels, and the average was about twice as high as the non-firefighters. But there's one guy who was off the charts at 1,600 ppb in his blood. And so they went to visit him and ask why. Was he drinking the Kool-Aid? He wasn't. He was actually eating healthy. He was eating 5 organic eggs a day, but they were grown in the backyard where they had grown their own homemade wheat for bread. And the bioaccumulation of the PFAS from the fire training pit into the wheat was eaten by the chicken, and the chickens bioaccumulate preferentially into the egg. And as he's on a high protein diet, he ate 5 eggs a day, and his blood levels got skyrocketed. He was individually singled out, and he had never used the firefighting foam personally, but he was eating it. And so there's a lot of ways these things can get into products. I think the food way is under stressed, but a worrisome one. I think most of our food is safe, but and the EPA has a study, or FDA did a study that said, oh, look, the food's safe. But there are a lot of foods we didn't look at yet, and there's a lot of individual field-to-field variations. We know that the cows in Maine and the cows in New Mexico have passed on to their milk, and some dairy farmers are out a lot of money. So I think that this unintentional sources or extra sources are very important, and I think this is a conference, first one I've seen where people are talking about it as widely as we are here.
How great. How about dermal exposure, Graham? I know in fabrics and those firefighters are using materials. Is dermal important here?
It depends who you ask. The one original study in 2012 said, oh, not a problem, but they even admitted in that study that, well, we didn't test every form of it and we didn't look at different conditions. And since that time, there have been 2 publications out this year, and we've got one in process, and somebody else is doing one I know of, that suggests that it isn't negligible. It may only be 1% or 2% that is applied to the skin that gets through. But that's pretty significant if you have a formulation in a cosmetic or things like that. And so those numbers will become more, once we've got more studies done in the next few years, you'll see that dermal absorption will not be 0 anymore. It'll be some number. Does it beat ingestion? Probably not. Probably ingestion wins, but you can imagine in your textiles or in your cosmetics where they aren't essential, that would be one way to reduce. And so I think dermal absorption, especially workers, people occupationally exposed to insecticides, splashing these things around, you shouldn't touch them anyway because insecticides themselves can be dermally absorbed. But it heightens the risk that you've now weakened your immune system by exposing yourself as well. So that's I think it's I don't think it's the primary worry at that moment, but it is a secondary one.
Okay. So we've got time for a few more questions, and
Sure.
There's a couple techie method questions here asking how many spectra do we have in the PFAS library when we're running mass spec, and then another one related to methods about comparability between 1633 and 537. Are the detection limits similar?
Yep, excellent questions, and somebody knows what they're talking about in both of them. The methods, the drinking water methods, have between 27 and 32, I think, standards associated with them. Of course, there are 2 standards for each. One is mass labeled and one isn't, but those are technical details. But the library standards are about 30 of them. The 1633 has got 40. Not all of them isotope labeled, but most of them isotope labeled, and so that means that you have 40 of which you can check against a standard. There exists in a company in Canada that makes all these standards. There exist about, I think, 70 or 80, maybe even a little bit more now. But we've got 12,000 compounds out there, so we only have a small fraction of what's there, and they're blessedly expensive. So operating one of these instruments with all these standards starts to be a pretty exorbitant expense to get these label standards out. So yes, they're standards. They're very precise. If you switch between methods, the reason you'd like to is that insecticides are kind of a mess. They're a mixture of things that aren't drinking water. Drinking water is about the easiest to use. And so those methods came out first. This one is the first, sediment is a pretty nasty method. And so this one works on sediment. It's designed to work on sludge. It's designed to work on biota. So if you take fish tissue, it's supposed to work on it. And that means it's testing for interferences that come from the fish. It tests for how extraction methods, and they report a recovery of between 70 and 130% of all the standards when they use them. So that's what the standard is. The detection limits are very comparable, a little higher in the 1633 because of the matrices defects, but they are all in part per trillion levels, and sometimes less than part per trillion in the drinking water, certainly. So I think that those are impressive feats. The 1633, in my opinion, is a method made by committee. It's got so many steps to it that it's very difficult to do correctly. So there are only a few commercial labs that do that one well, and I would get a really good commercial lab to do that test. But it's definitive. If you can run that and you don't see any PFAS, you probably don't have any there.
Okay, and we have part per trillion detection capability. Do you think we'll get to part per quadrillion if we wanted to match up with those EPA health standards?
Yeah, that's a good question, Greg. Those health standards are based on a lifetime exposure risk of drinking water at this level. So you don't have to get to that level. That risk is a precautionary principle saying if you drink water and you drink a certain amount per day, we all should, this is what you're being exposed to in the water. And that's based on, I think, a pancreatic cell line response, so cancer cells and pancreatic cancer cell line. So we know that any level, that level will will cause a bad effect, adverse health effect. So they're set correctly, but it's not what we would. It's based on a health effect. If we are going to look for a different source of exposure through, pesticides that are diluted, then sprayed on crops, and then bioaccumulated in a different crop, it's going to have a different. It's going to be a different number that we should be comparing. I mean, I've got 5 parts per billion in my blood, so do you, maybe higher, and that's one of the things that we need to, don't drink blood, but more importantly, where is that coming from, and what the sources are. And I think that the best we can do as a society is try to flag the big intentional uses and reduce them, and then define what essential use is. Maybe some pesticides are essential. Rarely. There are a couple of essential uses I think of PFAS, but there's about 200 that I can think of are non-essential. And I'm hoping that all the PFAS insecticides are non-essential uses, and that there are, green chemistry alternatives that will do that surfactant role in these compounds.
Okay, great. So another one here from Chris Victoria that's relevant to our Chesapeake Bay living resources concerns, and it's asking, what are our thoughts on ecological risk? Where do we have studies that help us with the stress and stress responses for aquatic organisms?
Yep, it's a great question. And I work with a biologist. We've just published a paper on maternal offloading on salmonoids, the Great Lakes salmon. They offload the PFAS to the eggs. And ecologically, we don't eat a lot of salmon eggs, but ecologically, the rest of the environment does. And so once these things get into the biota and into the sediment of the Chesapeake, for example, they will impact populations, absolutely. There are a few known examples of populations being affected. There are dozens yet to be studied. And what you need to know is a source of them. We see on individual streams and things like that, we see an effect. There's a stream in Illinois, I know, that has reduced the populations of certain microorganisms downstream from a spill and upstream from a spill and things like that. So I think those will be coming to light. We don't understand the biomagnification factors through all the biota yet, but we know that they exist. And it's weird. Some of them don't seem to bioaccumulate, some do. But that's one of the mysteries of these types of chemicals. There are several that are toxic and known toxic. There are several unknown toxicity. It doesn't mean they aren't. And then there's several that bioaccumulate and several that don't. They all persist. And according to Philip Grandjean, they all seem to have an immune suppression effect. That's, some with more effectiveness than others. So they all seem to have some health hazards. But the way I'd like to say it is I've never met a good PFAS in my blood, but it doesn't mean that we know the effects. And it's just concentration effects. Some have higher concentrations that have the same effect. But distressingly, a lot of these seem to have similar biological effects. And those biological effects, we are worried about humans mostly. But yes, the eco impact of these things is think of it worldwide. How many tons of this stuff are in the ocean, or in the bays, or in the Chesapeake? You've got a huge impact.
Yeah, really. And our understanding is that these PFAS are protein specific. They accumulate in organisms following a pattern of specific proteins that they're attracted to, as opposed to fats, which we think of from some of those organochlorines. Is that your understanding as well?
Yep, not a biologist, but that's exactly my understanding. They attach in human blood to something called a fatty acid binding protein, and that's different. It gets through the bloodstream and then individual organs, and that's why it takes so long in the body. In a human exposure rate, our shedding of PFAS from our blood takes years. Half-life of PFAS is about 4.5 years, and PFHXS is about 5.5 years. And that's a long time for a chemical that we ingest somehow. And strangely enough, in a mouse and a rat model, those are measured in terms of weeks. So mice and humans aren't alike when it comes to PFAS absorption. And it doesn't follow the fish fat tissue. It follows more the fish flesh, or the fish blood, actually, is what it follows mostly in our studies on fish so far. And so we don't know all that it binds to and why it would transport some and why some bioaccumulate and some don't. But that's true. And stay tuned. There's a lot of very good biologists and ecologists looking at this sort of effect and trying to find it.
Okay, well, you can bet we will stay tuned. So we have about 2 more minutes or so here, and here's one that's kind of quick. What about Teflon? Are all of our nonstick pans loading us up with PFAS?
Unfortunately, yes, though there's certainly Teflon manufacturers that will disagree with me in that they do nothing but the safe kind. Polymeric Teflon, of course, is quite safe biologically. You could swallow a roll of Teflon tape and it would pass through you with no ill effect, or no obvious ill effect, let's say. But the manufacture of it was these Teflon materials, these polyfluorinated polymers, fluorinated polymers, are made with monomer units, but also are floated on surfactants that are PFAS in their own right. And they switched from PFOA being commercially used to something shorter, PFBS, for example, a C4. And they have to, of course, use 10 times more of it than the PFOA. So it's there 10 times more, and it's more soluble. And everybody said, well, the C4 is safe, of course. That only lives in your body for weeks. And it's true. One of the reasons it lives in your body for weeks is you don't just excrete it normally, you actually exhale it through your lung. And if it's, in that sense, much less time in your body, it must be safer, is what the industry claimed. Then, of course, we had this natural, worldwide pandemic, global respiratory virus. Oops, somebody studied COVID, Granjin, and he noticed that there was a negative correlation with PFAS, not PFAS levels, but only C4, the PFBS and PFBA levels. And the higher those were in your blood, the worse outcomes you had for COVID. So, it's just that we haven't studied everything. We don't know where it goes. And the PFAS in polymers are hidden because the polymer itself is probably safe, but what comes out of the polymer is what worries me. And so I've taken aim at those things, and we'll see what the studies show in the future, but I'm worried about polymers. But as plastic pollution in the ocean is microplastics are a big concern and things like that, but that's not PFAS specific, that's all plastics. Mm-hmm. And I'll just end on the fact that my email is at the end of the talk there at gpeaslee@nd.edu. I will try to answer all the Q&As that I didn't get to just online here for the next couple of minutes. And then if anybody has questions, they're welcome to send them.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you again, Graham, for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
I think you've really helped us understand that there is likely a signal of PFAS coming through pesticide application. So that was very, very helpful to us today.